The photograph looked ordinary at first glance, a farmer's family posing proudly before their modest Nebraska farmhouse in 1907. A husband, a wife, 3 children, and behind them, barely visible among the corn stalks, a scarecrow watching over the field. Dr. Sarah Mitchell adjusted her glasses, squinting at the faded black and white print under the dim light of the Nebraska Historical Society archive. The late October sun drifted lazily through the tall windows, spilling amber light across rows of filing cabinets stuffed with forgotten histories. Dust motes shimmered in the air like tiny ghosts of the past. "This one's from the Thornton estate," she murmured, writing carefully in her ledger. Another routine donation. Eleanor Thornton, the last surviving member of the family, had passed away at 96. Her lawyer had delivered 3 boxes, photographs, documents, a few personal belongings, and a note saying that Eleanor wished her family's history to be preserved. Sarah had seen thousands of similar images during her 15 years as the Society's archivist. Families frozen stiff before the camera, their Sunday clothes too tight. Their smiles restrained their pride, barely masking a century of hardship. Nothing about this picture seemed unusual. At least, not at first. Sarah lifted the photo closer to the lamp, angling it for a better view. The light caught something faint in the background, a smudge perhaps, or a trick of exposure. She frowned and reached for her magnifying glass. Slowly, carefully, she focused on the scarecrow in the far corner of the field. Her breath caught what she had dismissed as shadows and grain was not that at all. The scarecrow had eyes. Not buttons or painted circles, but eyes that seemed alert, aware, and staring directly at the camera. That's not possible," she whispered. Her hands trembled slightly as she set the photograph on the wooden desk. The quiet hum of the old building seemed to fade, replaced by the faint whisper of the wind outside the windows. The archive room suddenly felt colder. Sarah called softly for her colleague. "James, come look at this." Dr. James Rodriguez, who had been hunched over a pile of notes nearby, looked up and joined her. He was researching early 20th century agricultural methods when Sarah's voice broke the stillness. "Tell me what you see," she said, handing him the magnifying glass. James leaned closer. His expression shifted from mild curiosity to something more uneasy. "Those look like human eyes," he murmured. "But that's impossible. The photography technology back then couldn't capture that kind of detail from such a distance, especially not in 1907. "Exactly," Sarah replied. She pointed at the depth of field. "See how the family is in perfect focus. Everything else should blur. But this scarecrow is crisp, too sharp, too deliberate." She looked again at the strange figure. The shoulders were too straight, the head tilted with eerie precision, and the clothing not burlap, not rags, but real work clothes. Heavy cotton, threadbare at the cuffs. A chill crept down her spine. "Eleanor mentioned family secrets in her will," Sarah said softly. "Her lawyer told me she seemed troubled before her death. Kept saying she wanted to set things right. Maybe this photograph has something to do with that." James frowned. "Look at the way it stands. Scarecrows don't stand naturally like that." He was right. The posture was too human. Almost as if whoever or whatever had been there wasn't meant to be seen. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Only the sound of the ticking wall clock filled the silence. Then Sarah straightened. "I need to see that farm." The next morning, she drove through the rolling plains of Nebraska. The land stretched endlessly in every direction. Golden fields, silent windmills, the occasional skeletal tree. The road turned from gravel to dirt, winding toward the ruins of the old Thornton property. She parked near what remained of the farmhouse. The two-story structure leaned wearily to one side, its windows broken and dark, its porch sagging under the weight of decades. The wind moaned through the empty doorway, carrying with it the scent of dry grass and distant rain. Sarah stepped out into the crisp October air, photograph in hand, and studied the landscape. The cornfield was gone, reclaimed by tall prairie grass and wild sunflowers. She walked slowly, matching her position to the old photograph. The horizon, the angle of the light. Yes, this was the place. Only a few rotted fence posts remained, and the foundation stones of what might have been a small outbuilding, a tool shed perhaps. Everything else had vanished into the earth. Her phone buzzed. It was a message from James. Found something in county records. Thornton family hired a man in 1907, Thomas Briggs. No record after that year. Owed 3 months' wages when he disappeared. Sarah's heart began to pound. She started photographing the property from different angles, trying to recreate the composition of the original image. As she stepped through the tall grass, something caught the sunlight, a faint glint, near where the scarecrow would have stood. She knelt and brushed aside the dirt. Beneath the layer of dried weeds lay a small metal button, the kind used on work clothes in the early 1900s. She held it in her palm. Cold, real, and for just a second, she had the strangest sensation that someone or something was watching her from the open field. Perhaps the same eyes that had once stared from that old photograph. Back in town, the warm hum of life returned. Sarah stopped at Murphy's Diner, the kind of place where time seemed to move slower and the walls remembered more than people did. The smell of bacon and fresh coffee filled the air. On the walls hung photographs of generations long gone men in overalls, women with lace collars, children in sepia tones, smiling with unspoken stories behind their eyes. Sarah slid into a worn red booth, the photograph resting on the table before her. When Martha Henderson, 83, sharp-eyed and steady-handed, came by to refill her coffee, Sarah gently turned the photo toward her. "Martha, do you recognize this family?" The woman adjusted her bifocals and peered closer. Her lips parted slightly. "Oh my, that's the old Thornton place." She hesitated. "My grandmother used to tell stories about them. Strange things. The kind people stopped talking about after a while." Sarah leaned forward, her voice soft. "What kind of strange things?" Martha's fingers brushed the edge of the photograph as if afraid to touch it. The whole family left town suddenly early 1908. Sold the farm for less than it was worth. People said they were running from something. A pause. Then almost a whisper. There was a hired hand. Went missing that same year. Folks said he'd gone to California, but others, she lowered her voice, glancing around the diner. Others said he never left the farm at all. Before Sarah could reply, an older man at the next table turned his head. His skin was weathered like old leather, his eyes pale blue and curious. "Name's Bill Crawford," he said. "Heard you mention the Thorntons." My great-uncle worked the railroad back then. Said Mr. Thornton came to town asking about train schedules, said their hired man had run off west. He paused, tapping a calloused finger on the tabletop. But that was strange because folks had seen the man Thomas, I think his name, was still working the fields 2 weeks after the Thorntons claimed he was gone. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "You're sure about that?" Bill nodded slowly. "As sure as you can be about something that old." My uncle said Mr. Thornton looked nervous, kept looking over his shoulder, like he was afraid of being watched. Martha added softly, "My grandmother used to say that the Thorntons left in the middle of the night. Didn't tell a soul, didn't even sell their livestock properly. Just vanished." Sarah sat back in silence for a moment. The murmur of voices in the diner seemed to fade into a dull hum. She looked again at the photograph, at the stiff figures, the hollow smiles, the watchful eyes in the distance. What had really happened in that cornfield? The next morning, Sarah descended into the courthouse archives, a basement heavy with dust and time. The air smelled of paper and iron. Shelves of old ledgers lined the stone walls, their bindings cracked and names fading from the leather. It felt like entering a tomb. She worked methodically through boxes marked 1907 or 1908. Each page whispered a fragment of the past property records, tax receipts, marriage licenses, and then finally an entry that made her stop. Thomas Briggs, hired hand, Thornton Farm. Wages unpaid. Whereabouts unknown. Last seen October 16th, 1907. Sarah's fingers trembled slightly as she traced the name. But 3 pages later, something else, a complaint filed by Martha Briggs, Thomas's sister. The words were shaky, but clear. "My brother has been cheated of his wages. The family refuses to speak of him. Please investigate." The complaint was dated October 30, 1907. That was 2 weeks after the Thorntons had already claimed Thomas had left for California. Sarah photographed every page carefully, her pulse drumming in her ears. The truth wasn't hiding. It was buried beneath paper and polite silence. A sheriff's note followed Thornton. Family questioned. Cooperated fully. No evidence found. She stepped out into the afternoon light, her lungs full of the crisp autumn air, and called James. "I found something," she said breathlessly. "There are discrepancies, the dates don't align." The family claimed Thomas left mid-October, but his sister filed a complaint at the end of the month. Witnesses say he was still seen working the field. James's voice crackled through the phone. "That's not all. I've been analyzing the photograph. The clothes on that scarecrow, they're not burlap. They're real work clothes. Heavy cotton, early 1900s style. And Sarah, there's something around the neck area. Looks like a rope." Sarah froze, staring out across the quiet courthouse square. A leaf tumbled past her feet. A rope. The wind carried a faint moan through the bare trees, and for a fleeting moment, she could almost hear the whisper of cornstalks and the sound of a man's last breath lost to the prairie wind. That night, as she reviewed her notes by lamplight, one thought refused to leave her mind. If the scarecrow had eyes, perhaps it was never a scarecrow at all. It was late afternoon when Sarah drove out past the grain elevators to the small farmhouse on County Road 17. The road was lined with cottonwoods, their leaves rattling softly like bones whispering secrets to the wind. She was there to meet Linda Walsh, a retired librarian and the great-granddaughter of Martha Briggs, sister of the missing farmhand. Linda greeted her at the porch with a polite but cautious smile. Her hair was silver, her hands trembling slightly as she motioned Sarah inside. The house smelled faintly of old paper and cedar, the scent of lives spent among books and memories. "I don't have much," Linda said, guiding her toward a small wooden box on the kitchen table. "But my grandmother, she kept this all her life. Said it was the last thing her brother ever wrote." Sarah's heart beat faster. Inside the box, carefully wrapped in linen, was a folded letter, browned by time. The ink had bled slightly, but the handwriting remained steady, desperate but deliberate. Linda hesitated before handing it over. She said he mailed it the week before he disappeared. No one believed it was real, but she did. Sarah took a deep breath, then unfolded the fragile paper. The words were uneven, the strokes heavy, as though written in fear. October 9th, 1907, Thornton Farm, Nebraska. "Martha, if you get this, I need you to know something's wrong here. The family's changed, or maybe they always were, and I just didn't see it before. Mr. Thornton says not to go near the north field. Says the soil there isn't right, but that's where the dogs keep barking at night. I've seen lights out there and shadows moving when there shouldn't be any. The missus says it's just crows. But crows don't sound like that. They don't whisper your name. I'm going to find out what's buried there. If I don't come back, don't let them say I ran away. Thomas." The final line was smudged as though a tear had fallen on the paper before it dried. Sarah sat in silence for a long moment, the ticking of the kitchen clock filling the air. Outside, the prairie wind sighed through the eaves, soft and hollow. Linda's eyes were wet when she spoke. "My grandmother never forgave herself. She went to the sheriff, but they told her Thomas probably joined a logging crew out west. She knew better. She said the night he vanished, she woke up to a sound like knocking, but there was no one at the door." Sarah's hand brushed the edge of the letter again. "Did your grandmother ever go back to the Thornton place?" Linda shook her head slowly. "No. She said once you leave that land, you don't go back. Something there remembers you." A shiver passed through Sarah's spine. The words carried an echo, faint but deliberate. "Something there remembers you." That night, back in her motel room, Sarah spread her notes across the bed. The letter, the missing wages, the scarecrow in the photograph. Every thread pointed toward the north field, the place Thomas Briggs said was not right. But what could be buried there for over a century? She called James again. "I think I need to go back to the Thornton property. There's more to that land than anyone's telling us." James was silent for a moment. "Be careful, Sarah. You said the photo was taken around 1907? "Yes." "Well, I ran the metadata on that copy you sent me. There's a second figure faintly visible behind the scarecrow, a shape human height, but it's transparent like a double exposure. The thing is, he hesitated. That part of the plate wasn't damaged. The exposure is clean. Whatever that shape is, it was there when the picture was taken." Sarah felt the air grow heavy. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the motel window like restless fingers tapping glass. She whispered. Then maybe Thomas never really left that field. The next morning, she drove back toward the old Thornton land. The dirt road wound between empty pastures, the cornfields long since gone, replaced by wild grass that swayed in solemn rhythm. The farmhouse itself had collapsed years ago, leaving only a chimney standing like a gravestone to a life that once was. She parked the car and stepped out, the air thick with the scent of rain and earth. A lone crow circled overhead. With each step toward the north field, the grass grew taller, tangled and dry. The wind made it hiss like something alive, and then she saw it, a shallow depression in the ground, ringed by stones. The remnants of what might once have been a fence post or marker. In the center, a thin wooden pole still stood, barely upright. A scrap of faded cloth clung to it, striped coarse and unmistakably human-made. Sarah knelt, brushing the dirt away with her hand. Her breath caught. Underneath, the soil was darker, almost black, and it smelled faintly metallic. She froze when she saw it, a fragment of bone, curved and pale, no larger than a fingertip. The prairie wind whispered across the field, carrying with it the faintest echo of a name. Thomas. Or maybe Sarah thought it was only the wind. By the time Sarah returned to the Thornton property, the morning light was cold and pale. A low mist rolled over the field, clinging to her boots and to the brittle stems that still whispered underfoot. She wasn't alone this time. Dr. Henry Whitaker, an archaeologist from the University of Nebraska, had agreed to meet her there. He was in his early 60s, calm, skeptical, with a voice that carried the quiet certainty of science. "You really think there's something buried out here?" he asked, glancing across the uneven land. Sarah nodded, showing him the letter. Thomas Briggs wrote this the week he vanished. He mentioned lights, noises, and something buried in this field. "I found what might be a human bone fragment." Whitaker sighed softly, squatting to inspect the soil. "Nebraska's full of bones, Ms. Mitchell. Buffalo deer, sometimes even older remains from native sites." "I know," Sarah said quietly. "But Thomas was here. And no one ever looked for him." He looked up at her, then studying her face, and finally gave a small nod. "All right, we'll do a small test dig." They began to mark a grid around the shallow depression. Each scrape of the trowel cut softly into the damp soil. Time itself seemed to slow, the hum of the prairie, the rustle of weeds, the metallic rhythm of metal against earth. It wasn't long before the first discovery came. "Here," Whitaker said, "something compacted. See the soil pattern." Sarah knelt beside him. Beneath the surface was a faint outline, rectangular, about 5 feet long. A grave, or perhaps something meant to look like one. As they dug deeper, a foul metallic scent rose from the earth. Whitaker's face grew tight. He motioned for one of his assistants to bring the light closer. Embedded in the soil were the remains of coarse cloth, thick stitching still visible. Not burlap work clothes like the kind farmhands wore at the turn of the century. Sarah's breath came slow. "Dr. Whitaker, look at the buttons." He brushed the dirt away gently. The buttons were iron stamped with a small pattern, a local manufacturer's mark from Omaha 1905. And then came the unmistakable sound of metal striking something solid. They widened the trench carefully. What emerged was a thin length of rope, old brittle, looped tightly and buried deep near where a neck would have been. Whitaker exhaled sharply. This isn't an animal burial. Sarah felt a chill crawl up her arms. The air seemed to thicken, heavy weighting. By dusk, they had uncovered enough to contact the local sheriff. The area was sealed off, and a forensic team was scheduled for the following day. Whitaker stood beside the trench, his face pale in the fading light. "There's something strange about the soil composition," he murmured. "The layer above the body, it's mixed with ash, as if someone burned something here before covering it." Sarah whispered, "To hide the scent." He looked at her, startled. "That's possible, but there's more. The ash isn't from wood. It's mostly bone ash. Bone. From what or whom, he didn't say. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She sat in her car near the field, watching the mist roll in again, like a tide of ghosts. The prairie seemed alive with murmurs, the sound of wind brushing against old fences, the creak of trees that no longer stood. At 2 a.m., a faint flicker of light appeared near the excavation site. Yellow, pulsing softly as if someone held a lantern out in the dark. She stepped out, heart racing. "Dr. Whitaker," she called softly. No answer. The light moved slowly, deliberately, toward the north end of the field, then vanished. Sarah followed its path until she reached the edge of the property, where the ground sloped down toward an old drainage ditch. There, half buried in mud, something caught the glint of her flashlight. A metal tag. She wiped it clean. Stamped into the corroded brass was a single word: Thomas. The following morning, the forensic team arrived. But by then, the mist had settled so thick over the field that even the markers from the previous day were gone, swallowed by the haze. Dr. Whitaker frowned, confused. The soil, it shifted. There's no sign of the trench we dug. They probed the ground, measured, dug again, but found nothing. The soil was uniform, undisturbed. Sarah stood frozen. She knew where the grave had been. The buttons, the rope, the bone, ash, all gone. She opened her bag, trembling, and pulled out the brass tag she'd found in the night. It was still there, cold and heavy. Whitaker stared at it. "Where did you get that?" She looked out across the empty field, where the mist still hung low. "He wanted to be found," she whispered, "but not by them." That evening, Sarah drove back into town, shaken but determined. She stopped at the courthouse again, hoping to find any trace, any document of what might have happened after 1908. There, in a forgotten ledger marked property transfers, she found one final quiet entry: Thornton Farm purchased by State Agricultural Bureau, 1910. Land deemed infertile, unsuitable for cultivation. Subsequent use restricted. She looked up the location in the modern database. The same coordinates, but the name had changed. It wasn't listed as farmland anymore. It was now under state protection as a wildlife preservation zone. And yet, even on the newest satellite images, Sarah saw it faint but unmistakable. A square shadow in the grass, almost like a foundation. Or a grave seen from the sky. That night, as she recorded her findings, she paused before ending her voice memo. Her voice came out quiet, uncertain. If Thomas Briggs was buried and then taken, where did he go? And who or what still guards that land? Outside, a storm was gathering. The wind rose, howling against the glass, and for a moment, just before the recording cut off, the microphone caught a sound from the distance. Not thunder, not the wind. It was the faint creak of a rope swaying back and forth. The following day, Sarah returned to the courthouse, unable to shake the feeling that something in the official record didn't add up. The land couldn't just erase itself, and people not truly gone had a way of leaving fingerprints on history even when others tried to wipe them clean. In the county archives, a young clerk led her down to a locked cabinet at the back of the room. "Those boxes are from the old sheriff's office," he said. "We only recently got permission to catalog them. Half of it's water damaged." The cabinet creaked open, releasing a smell of damp paper and old tobacco. Inside were dozens of manila folders, their labels faded, the ink almost gone. Sarah sifted through them one by one until she found a folder marked simply Boone 1908. Inside were 5 pages. The first was a typewritten report, brittle and yellowed with time. January 12, 1908, filed by Sheriff Walter Boone, Clay County, Nebraska. Unresolved incident at Thornton property. Witness reports indicate one hired hand, Thomas Briggs, missing since October 1907. Multiple complaints from Sister Martha Briggs. Family of Thornton claims he left for California. Verification attempts inconclusive. Search conducted on property limited by weather conditions. No body recovered. Area near Northfield shows signs of recent burning. Found evidence of rope partially buried. Case closed due to lack of remains. Below, handwritten in Boone's uneven script, were 2 additional lines. Note: Thornton family left county abruptly 2 weeks after inquiry. Personal remark. Not for public record, I have reason to believe the fire was meant to destroy more than evidence. Sarah stared at the final line until the letters seemed to blur. At the bottom corner of the file was another sheet, a telegram copy addressed to the State Bureau of Agriculture, dated February 1908. Request for state acquisition of Thornton land approved. Immediate restriction recommended. Soil contamination possible. Soil contamination. It wasn't about fertility. It was about burial. She called James from the courthouse steps, the wind carrying static across the line. The sheriff knew, she said quietly. He tried to warn them, but the land got bought by the state within weeks. They shut it down under the pretext of contamination. James hesitated. You realize, Sarah, if that's true, there may be more than one burial site out there. Her breath caught. What do you mean? I ran a topographic scan over the aerial images. There are indentations 4, maybe 5, all aligned along a straight path heading north. If those are graves, they were dug deliberately, not randomly. That night, Sarah sat alone in her motel room, surrounded by copies of the reports, the letter, and the photograph that had started it all. She stared at the old image, the family, the scarecrow, the blurred shape in the background. But now, with the light dimmed and her mind weary, she noticed something she hadn't before. in the lower corner of the photo, faint and almost erased, was a handprint. Not part of the image, but pressed onto the paper itself, as though someone had touched it before it fully dried. And beneath the scarecrow's shadow, she now saw what looked like a second shadow, stretched and thin, as if something beneath the ground was trying to rise. 2 days later, she convinced Dr. Whitaker to return. Despite the previous anomaly, he agreed, partly out of professional pride, partly because he too had begun to dream strange dreams since leaving the site. They arrived before dawn. The field lay silent under a heavy sky. The mist clung low, curling around their boots as if reluctant to let them pass. Whitaker set up ground-penetrating radar. The screen flickered, the signal faint. Then 5 distinct shapes appeared, roughly human length, perfectly aligned. He looked at Sarah, his face drained of color. 5, he whispered. Exactly as your friend suggested. They began to dig. After just a few inches, they hit a layer of charred soil and then more ash mixed with fragments of what looked like charred wood or bone. Whitaker backed away, breathing hard. This isn't right. The readings, they're changing. On the monitor, one of the shapes had begun to distort, lengthening, shifting, as though the soil itself were moving. And then, the ground beneath Sarah's feet gave a faint tremor. A low, hollow sound echoed through the field like a breath drawn deep from under the earth. She froze. Did you hear that? Whitaker didn't answer. He was staring at something behind her. Sarah turned slowly. In the fog about 50 yards away stood a figure, tall, unmoving, wearing what looked like old farm clothes. Its head tilted slightly to one side, and though the fog obscured its face, she could feel its gaze. When she blinked, it was gone. By midday, they stopped the dig. Whitaker refused to continue without official oversight. Sarah stayed behind as the team packed up, standing at the edge of the north field one last time. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of smoke and something else faintly sweet like burnt sugar. She knelt, touched the soil and whispered softly, "I found you, Thomas." For a moment, the wind seemed to pause. And then somewhere in the grass came the sound of something tightening, like a rope drawn taut. Months later, Sarah's article was published. It caused a brief stir among local historians, a remarkable rediscovery of a forgotten disappearance, they called it. But the details about the rope, the letter, the photograph, those she kept to herself. Dr. Whitaker never returned to the site. He resigned from the university soon after citing recurring stress-related dreams. The excavation was sealed again under state order labeled as an area of unstable soil. And as for the photograph, the original vanished from Sarah's office one night. Only her digital copy remained, though somehow when she opened it, the image had changed. The scarecrow was gone. Only the empty field remained. A year later, she returned one last time. The land was quiet again, overtaken by tall grass and the low hum of insects. She stood where the farmhouse once stood and whispered almost like a prayer, "I hope you're at peace now." The wind moved gently through the grass, and then faintly, almost imperceptibly, she heard a voice carried from somewhere deep within the field. "Still here." When she looked down, she noticed something new. In the dirt by her boot, where the grass had been pressed aside, lay a small iron button, rusted but unmistakable, stamped with the same 1905 mark from Omaha. She picked it up carefully, closed her hand around it, and didn't look back. As she walked away, the wind rose behind her, not angry, not mournful, but restless. Like something that had been half awakened and now waited patiently to be remembered again. Epilogue. Later listeners of Sarah's final recording would notice something odd. At the 34-minute mark, as she describes the field, there is a faint second voice overlapping hers. A man's voice, low and quiet, repeating the same words she spoke one heartbeat late. When analysts enhanced the audio, they found that the voice didn't match hers or Dr. Whitaker's or anyone present at the scene. The spectrogram showed the sound came from no external source. It came from the recorder itself. And in that ghostly voice, barely audible beneath the static, he says, "One last thing. Don't dig anymore. Pause, fade out music. Whisper." And so, dear listener, when you pass a field left to ruin the kind, where the wind seems to move a little slower and the crows never quite leave, remember the Thornton land. Some places you see don't forget. They just wait.